Good afternoon, everybody. So I was going to go through the phase completion on buildings of works in compliance with Article 20F. So going to quick look at the building control regulations, the code of practice, phase completions of compliance with completion. So they'll have a few examples to go through on those. And look at the difference between phased CCCs under the building control regulations and partial completion, which is sometimes referred to on building contracts. They're two different things. They shouldn't be confused. I'm going to quickly touch on the pre-notification of CCCs. We're going to look at the shell and core in regard to Part L for buildings other than dwellings. Then compliance with building regulations for buildings or works and that form part of phased CCC. I'll just quickly go back to Building Control Authority's validation. So Certificate of Compliance Completion, it's 20F, so it notes that the register that a building may not be occupied, opened or used unless it has a CCC which is registered under Part 4, and especially where there's compliance with Part 2 and Part 3A. Phase completions are covered under 20F9, so it notes that the cert might refer to works, buildings, including areas within a building, or developments, including phases thereof, and notes that the relevant details should be clearly identified on the Certificate of Compliance itself, and is subject to validation in line with requirements of paragraphs 3 and 4. So paragraphs 3 and 4, we've seen them a few times today. Just to note, highlighted text there that when the CCC comes in, it's accompanied by plans, calculations and specifications. In particular, is to outline how the building or works completed either differ from the original plans, calculations and specifications that were included in the commencement notice. And they should be listed in the annex to the CCC as noted as being additional information or changes. And it notes that the CCC should include information that demonstrates compliance with requirements of the second schedule of building regulations A to M, and it should be accompanied by the inspection plan as implemented by the assigned certifier. And then 4 just goes through the requirements of the building control authority to check, and just to note that they should be checking under 4B2, and just note that all requests, statutory process, including any application for certificates under Part 3, Part 3A or Part 3B for the relevant building concerned have been satisfactorily concluded. So just to note again, the sort of touchstone for all this is the Code of Practice, which is issued under the Building Control Regulations 20G, and the Minister may from time to time publish this Code of Practice. And we'll just note that when buildings or works are inspected in compliance with the Code of Practice, that it is prima facie compliant with the building control regulations. And then just noting that any other approaches that should not be construed that the Code of Practice is the only way of doing it, but it should be under a similar suitable framework. So just go through the duties. The assigned certifier, again, is competent, registered professional, and is assigned to the project by the building owner to inspect and certify the works. The builder is a competent builder, assigned by the building owner again. Design certifier means a competent registered professional. Again, he is commissioned by the owner to design in conjunction with others the building or works. And then the building owner means the person who is commissioned or paid for the works and has legal entitlement to have such works carried out on their behalf, and who submits the commencement notice 17 notice in accordance with the building control regulations. So in the Code of Practice, under Section 8, goes through a completion stage. So under Section 8.1b, just to note, where design documents have changed or superseded design documents previously lodged from the building control with the Building Control Authority with commencement notice or an out date should any difference be clearly identified. So when you're submitting your CCC, you have to clearly identify if there's any changes to any of the works that would be major enough to require notification to the Building Control Authority. And then the phase completions, just note that may refer to works, buildings, including areas within a building, or developments, including phases thereof. In such circumstances, one or more certificates of compliance may be referenced in one single commencement notice, We'll get onto that, especially with dwellings. All builders and assigned certifiers signing certificates of compliance completion should clearly identify the precise building units and the works to which it relates. So again, we have issues with people still putting in their planning description in their description of works at a CCC stage, which is not relevant. It should identify the works and the area of works or the number of units or the buildings that are being CCC'd at that stage. So just when you're submitting the submission page on Drupal, in case no one's ever seen it, that's where you submit your CCC. So the assigned certifier chooses the right commencement notice and 7-day notice. They must indicate if it's the CCC is pre-notification. They must identify what the CCC is for. Is it full completion of buildings or works? Is it phased completion of building or works? Or is it completion of some buildings or works? And just again to reiterate that, the assigned certifier must complete the description of works in accordance with 20F, and the relevant details should be clearly identified. So it should be concise, to identify the works clearly. So example 1 here for phased development, we have a housing development. There was 3 phases submitted under 3 commencement notices. You have phase 1, which was 12 houses, phase 2, 7 houses, phase 3 was 5 houses. So 3 individual commencement notices were submitted to cover each phase. So each house can have a separate CCC or group of houses if completed at the same time. So in this example, we'll say in phase 1, that block was CCC'd at one stage, that was CC'd at one stage as well. So they can all be handed over in blocks, or in phase 2, they can be handed over as individually houses. And that is the preference, especially for conveyancing, that if it's an individual house, that it should be have its own individual CCC. It makes it much easier for conveyance point of view. And then just the last one was handed over as one. So just to note, semi-detached and terrace dwellings can be submitted under separate CCCs, but in practice, these separate CCCs should be submitted together as they're reliant on the adjoining buildings. So if one part of the semi-detached is not complete, if the roof's not on or it's not tiled properly, obviously you can't CCC the other side because it's reliant on the roof to be complete, the whole building. But they can be submitted together as separate CCCs, and then that is much more convenient for conveyancing at the end. But again, they're both valid ways of submitting a CCC. So you could do it for the whole block, or you can do it for individually. Individual is the preference. So we're looking at phase completion hotel. So hotel is consists of 40 bedrooms, reception, lobby, bar, function room, etc. It's granted a fire safety certificate and a disability access certificate for the whole works, and it's submitted as part of one commencement notice. So it's not possible to phase that because the fire cert relates to the whole building. And when you come to CCC stage, you are signing off that you are compliant with A to M. And compliance with B is reliant on you completing the works in accordance with the granted fire cert, and compliance with M is reliant on you complying with the requirements of the DAC. So in that case, the phase completion scenario, if you wanted to phase it, you'd have to look for a revised fire cert or DAC to identify the areas that you wished to inhabit or occupy, and then you would have to a secondary or tertiary one to occupy the areas that were not covered by the FSC. But if it's one building, one fire cert, the CCC is for the whole building. And again, you must have the granted fire cert to occupy. So again, we look at this similar situation as a multi-story office block. So it contains entrance, lobby, 4 floors of offices, 2 staircores, and the owner's intention is that they wish to have the 3 lower stories fully finished and the main building fitted out by a subsequent tenant. So what's the approach? So the reception areas, common areas, lifts would be under the first CN. The office plates would be completed under the first phase of CN and the fire detection system, and also fire ratings of walls, floors, and apartment walls would be in the unoccupied areas, as we call them. And then subsequent fit out would usually be required to install common rooms, office, meeting rooms, etc. And that would be under a second phase CN or another CN after that as well, which will cover the works to fit out the areas that weren't included in the fire cert as occupied areas. So again, I'll just go through that again. So as there's one building, there's only one commencement notice. The assessment of the building required works to allow the occupation of the first phase of the building, reception areas, common areas, lifts, etc. under phase one, and then the office places will be completed, to allow fit out, separate commencement notice, with additional fire certs, DACs for those areas, and second or subsequent. So if we look at that, so we have the building itself. So the construction of the building is under CN. So that's the building we're building. The fire cert only shows that these areas are to be fitted out and occupied, and that the fire cert and the DAC relate to those areas. And the plant room at the top as well would be required to be included in that just as a common area. And then the other areas of the building would be left with the required fire detection system and fire separation from other parts of the building to allow for the fit of them at a later date. Now, I won't go into it, but the fire detection systems would also have to be cognizant of if there's no ceiling in those areas, the underside of the ceiling might be corbelled or it might be downstands to ensure that the fire detection system is compliant to ensure that those areas are covered by a detection system. So then we would have subsequent commencement notices to cover the fit out of the remaining floors and the required FSCs and DACs to cover the works, and then a valid CCC, fire cert and DAC are required to allow the occupation of those areas. Similar again, there might be mixed-use residential offices, etc., where you have apartments above and a cafe area below. So you can complete the residential buildings under one fire cert and allow the ground floor to be shown as being a fit out at a later stage. You can CCC that, but any subsequent CCC or fire cert for the units below would have to be done individually after that as a new fire cert. And then similarly, retail shopping centre, similar situation. The landlord areas, the mall circulations might be fitted out, might have an anchor tenant who might fit out their unit as well at the commencement of the work. So you might have areas of the anchor tenant and the common areas might be finished, and you will have areas around that which will be unfinished. They will still be included in the fire cert, but they will be demonstrated to have the minimum requirement for fire separation and fire detection. And then on opening day, the anchor tenants and the sort of public areas will be allowed to be opened, and then the subsequent areas would have to have fire certs and DAC certs completed for them, and a commencement notice would have to be submitted to cover those works. So again, it's just a shopping centre. We're going to say that area is the area that's going to be underneath the preliminary fire cert that for occupation. And the rest is going to be occupied at a later date, and those individual units would have individual fire certs and DACs to cover the works within them. Those works within them might have individual lifts, they might have staircases, they may have other sanitary facilities inside those areas. Again, commencement notices and a fire cert would have to be completed for those. Just a note on the shell and core with Part L. So Part L indicates that when you are looking at a non-dwelling, you have to ensure that NEEP calculation should be compatible with the intended end use of the building and the servicing strategy, and the building meets the renewable provisions for the whole building when completed and prior to the occupation of that part. So similarly to the office building earlier on, we looked at, when you're looking at the size of those fire escapes, for instance, you base it on the fact that the building will be an office building and you will have a certain amount of occupation. Similarly, when you're sizing the the power plant and the renewables for the building, you assume that it's going to be the fully completed. So you can't, so at completion stage, there should be renewables there that will cover the eventual occupancy of the building. You can't sort of add on bits of renewables as the project goes on or as the project occupied. It has to demonstrate compliance with Part L. And just there, they should be based on the building shell as constructed and the fixed building services as actually installed. So just considerations to have. So most of the other speakers talked about it too. Phasing should be considered at commencement. So it's very, you should have a very clear idea in your head, well, how are you going to commence the phases and what phases are going to be handed over at a particular stage. And signing the CCC, the AC and the builder are confirming the building or parts of the building are in compliance with the regulations, parts A to M. Phases should not rely on other parts of the building which have not been issued to CCC. So in that diagram there, someone is trying to phase one of a occupancy on top of a basement which hasn't been CCC'd yet. So you can't do that because you're relying on a structure which hasn't had a compliance confirmed. So you would have to reverse that. It would have to be, the basement would have to be, and the basement and its fire cert would have to be shown to be compliant before you could occupy that, and then you could occupy the subsequent areas. Just to note that if the phasing strategy changes, it might require changes to the fire cert and or DAC. So if you're changing how you're occupying a building, if say for instance in the shopping centre example, if the anchor tenant withdraws, you might have to revise your fire cert to bring that back to the anchor tenant being unfinished and only CCCing the actual common areas and waiting for the a new anchor tenants to submit a CCC or a CN for the new works. And as has been iterated a few times, always consult with the local building control authority on how your phasing strategy is to work, because they were the people who will be looking at it and trying to understand how your strategy works and is it in compliance. Are you demonstrating compliance with parts A to M? So just a quick thing about phase completions and partial completions. So phase completion allows for a certificate of individual phases of a development, requires separate commencement notices and completion certificates at each phase, should be planned in advance. Each phase should be fully compliant with the building regulations independently, designed to facilitate large multi-stage projects, must be in accordance with the granted fire cert, disability cert. Just on the partial completion, we don't get into this as a building control side, but it's a contractual concept, and it's not regulated by BCAR. It refers to when a part of a building can be handed over as part of a completion. It may allow the owner to take possession of a site, and it's usually, back in the day, it was more about insurances and release of retention usually, so that they would hand it over to the builder and the builder would be able to release retention. It's nothing to do with building control. We don't get involved in the contractual side of it. So the terms are usually defined by the construction contract, and it doesn't allow the opening or operating or occupying of that part of the building in the absence of a CCC. So if you get a partial completion cert from a builder, it means nothing from a building control point of view. It just means that they've given you a cert saying that they've finished a particular part of the building. Until the CCC is issued, you cannot occupy that or use or open that part of the building. Just again, I won't dwell on this, that's just to reiterate about the pre-notification, must be submitted to the Building Control Authority not falling more than 5 weeks, not less than 3 weeks. They will consider the validity of the respective CCC in accordance with paragraphs 3 and 4. Again, that's just the timeline again. And just to note that at the end of that process, the Building Control Authority may still invalidate or validate the search. So it's not, it may, if there's something wrong with the CCC when it's submitted 2 days before, it might be rejected. So if it's rejected, as Richard noted earlier on, you're back to a normal CCC process where you submit the documentation and wait for your 21 days for your CCC. So just to reiterate the role of the Building Control Authority, they validate the submission, they check the cert properly completed and signed. They checked the annex and the CCC were properly completed. They checked the inspection plan was implemented. They checked there was no unresolved matters in relation to Section 11 or enforcement notice, and note any conditions of fire safety cert and disability cert, etc. So that's why you have to ensure that your fire safety cert lines up with the areas that you are occupying under, or you intend to occupy under the CCC. So this is a query we got, like generally, which is from solicitors and private owners, where they say they've got a CCC, but it just describes units 1 to 20 on a particular road or a particular site. And how can I identify mine? And my solicitor wants a one-off CCC, which is from a house. As I said earlier, it is allowable to do it, but our preference under the Code of Practice notes that it should be preferably in individual CCCs for individual houses, because it makes the conveyancing part of it much easier. And I won't go through this, our FAQ 28, that goes through all the points that we talked about today. So it just notes any phasing is dependent on the proposing the CCC should be carefully considered in the context of the independency of parts A to M for each of the buildings and other phases of development. It should note that the compliance has to be noted for each stage, and compliance of part A to M should be addressed both individually and collectively. And just to note that the CCC has to be submitted and registered before the works or buildings to which Part 2 and Part 3A apply may be opened, occupied or used. Again, when we come back to the 20F B2, just to note, we have to comply with the requirements of the second schedule of the building regulations, that is parts A to M. So the only caveat is that if you had a relaxation or a dispensation of one of those parts, or a subpart of one of those, you don't have to comply, obviously. But in general, it's part A to M that you are going to be complying with. Just to look at the CCC actual cert itself, just to note, the description is important. The description should be note the exact area that's being CCC'd, the description of the works. Again, the builder is signing up to compliance with part A to M. Compliance with B and M is demonstrated by buildings in accordance with the granted fire cert. The Code of Practice, Section 7 of the CCC, and again, under Section 8, parts A to M are noted for the assigned certifier. And that's it. Thank you very much.